And ladies and gentlemen, I want to begin by asking you a simple question. What is the value of a single life? Not in numbers, not in politics, but in the pure sense, what is it worth to protect one child? Today, I will not share with you theories or strategies. I will share a story, real, raw, and deeply painful. It is about an 18-month-old baby, a child who never had the chance to dream, to laugh freely, or to live the life that every child deserves. This baby was taken away by a sniper's bullet, and what is even more shocking is that the world chose silence. Now, why am I telling you this? Because this is not only about one child, one family, or one country. This is about us, all of us. It is about the values we claim to hold, the humanity we promise to protect, and the responsibility we cannot afford to ignore. In this speech, I will take you through 6 powerful reflections, each of them a reminder of how fragile our humanity becomes when we stay quiet in the face of injustice. I want you to stay with me until the very end, because what you will hear is not only a story of loss, it is a challenge to our conscience, a call to action, and a chance to rediscover what it truly means to be human. If you listen carefully, you will understand that the silence of the world is more dangerous than the sound of the gunshot. So open your hearts, open your minds, and let's walk through this journey together. By the end, you will not only feel the pain of this tragedy, you will also feel the strength of the responsibility it leaves behind. The image of an 18-month-old baby, a child who had barely begun to discover the world, represents the purest form of innocence. At that age, life is defined by small joys, the first steps, the sound of laughter, the trust in a mother's embrace. The child's world is untouched by politics, ideology, or conflict. This innocence is what makes such a tragedy unimaginably painful, because it reminds us of what has been stolen, not only from the family, but from humanity itself. A baby at 18 months symbolizes hope, continuity, and the future. The loss of such a life is not just a personal tragedy. It is a wound to the collective conscience of the world. When violence reaches children, it strips away the last justification for conflict. No political explanation, no security claim, no military rationale can ever excuse the deliberate or reckless act that ends the life of someone so young. In that single moment, the cruelty of war reveals itself in its rawest form. An innocent baby does not carry a weapon, does not pose a threat, does not belong to any faction. Their only identity is being a child, a universal bond understood by every culture, every nation, every faith. To see that innocence destroyed is to confront the darkest side of human behavior. This also forces us to reflect on the sacred value of life. Children are born without prejudice, without hate, without division. They represent the possibility of a better tomorrow, one free of the mistakes of the past. To take away such a life is to rob the future of its potential. Every child has within them the seeds of creativity, kindness, and change. The death of a baby is therefore not just the silencing of a single life, but the silencing of generations of possibility. The story of this 18-month-old also holds up a mirror to society. It challenges us to ask whether our empathy has boundaries, whether our moral concern is selective. If we cannot unite in outrage at the killing of a baby, what does that say about the state of our humanity? This innocence, which should have been cherished and protected, became the victim of violence and indifference. It highlights that at the core of this tragedy is not only the brutality of one act, but the broader failure to recognize and defend the most basic right, the right of every child to live. When a baby's life is cut short in such a brutal manner and the world chooses to remain silent, it signals something far more dangerous than political indifference. It exposes a collapse of moral responsibility. Humanity is not measured only by technological progress or economic growth. It is measured by the way we protect the most vulnerable. When global institutions, leaders, and societies fail to raise their voices for an innocent child, the very foundation of morality begins to crumble. Silence becomes complicity, and complicity turns into acceptance of what should never be acceptable. Throughout history, silence in the face of injustice has always been remembered as a stain on human conscience. When atrocities were committed and the world chose to look away, those moments left behind legacies of regret. What happened to this child is not just a matter of one community or one nation, it is a test of whether humanity as a whole still recognizes the difference between right and wrong. If leaders can condemn acts in some parts of the world, yet ignore the same crimes elsewhere, then morality is no longer universal but selective. And selective morality is no morality at all. The moral collapse becomes even more evident when societies normalize tragedy. If news of a child being shot can be consumed and forgotten like any other headline, then empathy has been eroded to a dangerous degree. Indifference to such suffering breeds a culture where violence loses its shock value, and once the world stops being shocked by the killing of children, it stops fighting to prevent it. The silence is not just political. It seeps into the hearts of ordinary people who no longer feel compelled to demand change. A child's death in such circumstances should be a moment of unity for the global community, a point where differences of politics, religion, or geography dissolve. Yet when that unity does not happen, it suggests that humanity has allowed divisions to outweigh its conscience. Moral collapse is not the absence of values. It is the deliberate choice to set them aside when they become inconvenient. It is the decision to let power, alliances, and self-interest silence the most fundamental human instinct to protect life. This silence, more than the act itself, reveals the depth of humanity's moral failure. The tragedy of an innocent baby's death also uncovers the stark reality of how media chooses which stories deserve attention and which ones fade into silence. In today's interconnected world, people do not only rely on direct experiences to understand global events, they rely heavily on what they see, hear, and read in the media. Yet, not all suffering is treated equally. Some tragedies are amplified, dissected, and broadcast repeatedly until the world feels compelled to respond, while others are reported briefly or ignored altogether, leaving them to vanish into obscurity. This selective outrage reveals not only bias, but also the power of narratives to shape public perception and ultimately political action. When the killing of an 18-month-old child receives little coverage, it reflects a painful truth. The value of a human life is often determined not by its innocence, but by its political context. Media outlets influenced by national interests, alliances, or fears of backlash decide how much empathy the global audience should feel. A baby in one part of the world is mourned universally, while a baby in another part becomes a footnote. This double standard does not just distort reality, it erodes the very principle of equality in human dignity. Selective outrage also allows injustice to thrive. When crimes against the vulnerable go underreported, they create space for perpetrators to act with impunity, knowing their actions would not generate the global pressure that could restrain them. The silence of coverage does not mean the suffering is less severe. It simply means the world is less willing to confront it. This inequality of attention becomes a form of violence itself because it denies victims the recognition and solidarity they deserve. The impact on societies is profound. People who consume biased information begin to form biased perceptions, often sympathizing with one group of victims while remaining indifferent to others. Over time, empathy becomes conditional rather than universal. This not only divides humanity, but also weakens the moral resolve needed to challenge injustice wherever it occurs. The death of a child should be a headline that unites the world in grief and outrage, yet when the media chooses silence or minimization, it teaches audiences to treat some lives as expendable. The imbalance in coverage is therefore not just a journalistic failure, but a collective moral one, as it conditions societies to accept that not all children's lives carry the same worth. When violence against the most vulnerable goes unanswered, it creates an environment where injustice becomes normalized and impunity flourishes. The killing of an 18-month-old child is not only an attack on a single life, but also a test of whether the world is willing to demand accountability. When nations, institutions, and leaders remain silent, they send a message that such acts can be carried out without consequences. This absence of justice emboldens those who commit violence, allowing them to believe they are beyond reproach. In such an environment, one tragedy quickly becomes many as perpetrators repeat their actions, confident that the world will look away again. Accountability is not only about punishing the guilty. It is about establishing a principle that no life is too small, too distant, or too politically inconvenient to protect. Justice serves as both a moral obligation and a deterrent. If those responsible for harming a child know they will face the weight of international law, the likelihood of similar atrocities decreases. Yet when there is no trial, no condemnation, and no consequence, silence itself becomes a shield for the oppressor. Justice delayed or denied is not just a failure of institutions. It is a betrayal of humanity's promise to uphold the sanctity of life. The failure to pursue accountability also weakens faith in the systems created to protect human rights. International courts, human rights organizations, and governments lose credibility when they selectively enforce justice. People witnessing these failures begin to question whether these structures exist to serve all humanity or only the powerful. This erosion of trust has dangerous consequences, as communities who feel abandoned by global systems may lose hope in peaceful solutions and turn toward despair or radical alternatives. The death of a child should have been a rallying cry for leaders across the world to stand together to affirm that even in conflict, there are moral red lines that must never be crossed. Instead, silence and inaction reveal how easily principles are set aside when they conflict with political interest. True accountability demands courage, because it requires challenging not only the perpetrators, but also the systems that allow them to act unchecked. Without that courage, justice remains an empty word, and the lives of the most innocent continue to be sacrificed to the convenience of the powerful. Silence is often mistaken for neutrality, but in the face of injustice, it is never neutral. When an 18-month-old baby is killed and the world responds with silence, that silence functions as permission for the violence to continue. To say nothing is to align, even unintentionally, with the side of the oppressor. The absence of words, protest, or collective condemnation does not erase the crime. It amplifies its impact by removing accountability. Public education does not erase the crime. It amplifies its impact by removing accountability. In this way, silence becomes a weapon, not in the hands of the victim, but in the hands of those who caused the suffering. The power of silence is not only in what it fails to do, but also in what it communicates. It tells the perpetrators that their actions will go unchallenged, that they can cross moral and human boundaries without fear of consequence. It tells the victims and their families that their pain does not matter, that their grief is invisible, and that their loved one's life holds less value in the eyes of the world. Silence, therefore, deepens the wound of loss, turning a tragedy into an enduring reminder of abandonment. At the same time, silence erodes the moral strength of those who choose it. For individuals and nations alike, the refusal to speak out corrodes the principles they claim to uphold. Silence in the face of violence against a child undermines every declaration of human rights, justice, and equality. It reveals a hypocrisy that weakens moral authority because words spoken in other contexts lose their credibility when they are absent in moments that matter most. History has repeatedly shown that silence does not stop injustice, it sustains it. Whether in times of war, oppression, or persecution, silence has always been remembered as the ally of cruelty. The same is true here. The lack of collective outrage over the death of an innocent baby becomes part of the crime itself. Silence is not passive. It actively shapes the outcome by protecting those in power and isolating those who suffer. To remain silent in such a moment is to deny the very essence of shared humanity. It strips society of empathy, replacing it with apathy, and apathy is fertile ground for future atrocities. The power of silence, therefore, is not in its ability to keep peace, but in its capacity to strengthen the very injustice it refuses to confront. The death of an 18-month-old baby is not only a tragedy confined to one family or one community, it is a challenge to the conscience of every human being. Beyond borders, politics, or ideologies, it forces us to reflect on what it means to be human and whether we are willing to uphold the dignity of life in its most fragile form. Human responsibility does not begin and end with sympathy. It requires action, courage, and the willingness to speak when silence is easier. To see such an injustice and remain detached is to deny the basic bond that unites all people, the recognition that every child's life has equal worth. This responsibility lies not only with governments or institutions, but with individuals. Each person has a voice, and when voices combine, they create a collective force that can influence change. The story of a child's life cut short should not be left as another forgotten tragedy. It should become a call for humanity to recognize that responsibility extends beyond national interest or personal comfort. To defend the innocent is not a political act. It is a human one. Every citizen, journalist, leader, or teacher carries a part of this responsibility because indifference is a choice, and that choice shapes the world we live in. The essence of human responsibility is empathy transformed into action. It is the ability to look beyond statistics and headlines and see a face, a life, a future that has been stolen. In the death of one child, we should see the fragility of all children and the urgency to protect them. This recognition should inspire people to raise their voices, demand accountability, and refuse to allow power or politics to determine whose suffering is worth acknowledging. The world cannot afford to separate responsibility from humanity. If we only defend those closest to us, if we only speak when it is safe, then we have limited the very meaning of justice. True responsibility is universal. It is the conviction that no matter where a child is born, their right to live is sacred. The loss of this baby should awaken that conviction, reminding us that our duty is not selective. It is shared, and it demands that we rise above fear, apathy, or self-interest to protect what is most valuable, human life itself. In closing, the death of an 18-month-old baby is not just a single heartbreaking story. It is a mirror reflecting the state of our world. It reveals the fragility of innocence, the silence of nations, the bias of narratives, the absence of accountability, the dangerous power of indifference, and the urgent call for human responsibility. If we fail to see beyond politics and divisions, then we fail not only this child, but every child who deserves a world built on justice and dignity. The question is not whether the tragedy was real. The question is whether our response will define us as protectors of humanity or as silent witnesses to its decline. Let us not allow silence to be our legacy. Let us transform outrage into action, grief into courage, and empathy into responsibility, because in defending the life of one child, we defend the very idea of humanity itself. Good luck in carrying this message forward, and thank you for listening with an open heart and a conscience willing to reflect.